introductions, our distinguished panel of experts. We have Dr. Alain Bertaud. He is an urban planning veteran and an academic of global repute who has worked with many cities worldwide, including Chandigarh, where he collaborated with Le Corbusier. He is the author of Order Without Design, How Markets Shape Cities. It is an influential book and a must-read for anyone interested in understanding the urban space. Dr. Bimal Patel is a distinguished fellow at Artha Global, and he's also the chairman and MD of HCP Design Planning and Management. He's an architect, designer, planner, academic, wears many hats, and he's currently leading the Central Vista Parliament project in Delhi. Dr. P Agarwal is also a distinguished fellow at Artha Global and Niti Aayog, and he's a professor at Indian School of Public Policy and IIT Roorkee. He is a former IS officer. He authored India's National Urban Transport Policy of 2006. And Dr. Agarwal served as the CEO of World Resources Institute. Our next guest is Shashi Verma, who is the Chief Technological Officer at Transport for London, where he oversees technology, strategy, planning, and funding for transport systems. He has taught public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Verma grew up in India, and therefore he brings great comparative perspective between Indian cities, London, and the rest of the world. And we also have Amrita Agarwal. She is an independent advisor on health, and she previously led the health system design portfolio at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Let me begin with the theme of this webinar, and this is essentially what the essays authored by our experts discussed. What is the new imagination for Indian cities today? Pritika, you've already explained the housekeeping rules. We have 5 minutes for each speaker, and we could start with Dr. Bertaud.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. Well, for me, I believe that cities are before labor market. So for Indian city, what is really important is to take the full advantage of large labor market. India has large cities, has large labor market, but those labor markets are very much fragmented because some regulation, land use regulation, but also because of inadequate transport. Another aspect of Indian labor market is the lack of female participation compared to your neighbors in Asia. And I think that if more women could participate in the labor market, that will also improve greatly creativity and productivity. So to summarize, I think that the first thing is to study those labor market and make them effective. They are only potential at the moment because of, again, lack of infrastructure and some social issues. The second is to review very carefully land use regulation. Land use regulation have been very often inherited, I would say even from colonial time, and has not been revised very much. And so they have a very high economic consequences. The regulation, in fact, decide in advance what is the input in land and floor space in every part of the city. And this should be based on economics, should be based on the price of land and the income of people. It should not be based on a magic number which was decided, maybe 50 years ago or 100 years ago, possibly. So finally, I think that, and I think my colleague, Mr. Verma, will speak more on that. I think that transport is absolutely essential in order to be able to to integrate those labor market. Again, large cities have potentially large labor market, but they are only potential. They can reach their potential only if if there is a transport system which allow anybody in a large conurbation like say Delhi or Mumbai to go from one part of the city to another in less than 1 hour. This will be our goal. And the average, of course, transport time should be about 30 minutes. So we have to adjust our transport system and our land use system to be able to do that. Finally, I will have a note of optimism about Indian labor market. I've been working a lot in Asia and in the rest of the world, by the way. And I think at this moment, the demography favor India. Many countries of the world in Asia and in Europe are in fact have a very low birth rate. And so the labor market, in fact, is shrinking and aging. India is just at this moment at a sweet spot. It may not last forever. Maybe it will follow the world trend, and within 20 years, there will be also a much lower birth rate. But so this is an opportunity, and I think if India can seize this opportunity by doing the reform which are necessary in urban, the productivity and creativity of India will really be shown, and it will allow India to get out of what the World Bank call the middle income trap, trying from middle income to high income. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Looking forward to hear the.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bertaud. Dr. Patel, would you like to go next?
I think it's on mute.
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you very much. I have 3 or 4 points to make. What I'd like to see, if we really want to unleash the power of Indian cities, then we have to free them up to function by themselves. This is really very, very important. Unfortunately, when our constitution was made, we had a federal structure. You have the central government, you have the state government, but cities were not recognized as an entity by themselves. And cities were very much created by state governments and remain completely subservient to state governments. Nowhere in the world you've had a real economic growth and well-being of cities without the power of cities being unleashed and without them being autonomous. So we have a process. First, the entire burden of economic development was, in a sense, borne by the central government. They, people in Delhi believed that it was their job to take India forward. Fortunately, that has changed over the years, and the states are all now competing with one another for investments, and this has been very good for the country. Now we have to look for a time at which one state realizes that really giving autonomy to its cities is really the way to unleash the power of the state, which will require radical change and a radical thinking. But if we got one step, maybe I'm quite hopeful that we'll get the next step. Somebody has to innovate, and then everybody will have to follow, because that'll really unleash the power of cities. I say this from experience of Ahmedabad, where some of the times at which Ahmedabad has been at its best and functioning at its best, from the time that the British colonial government was here, was when the city elites were leading the development of the city. So the very first water supply scheme in Ahmedabad was done by, the person who set up, who was president of the municipality, and also the first mill owner. The first mill was established by him. The next, we all know the name of Sardar Patel. He was also a city elite person running the municipal corporation. and made it, and Ahmedabad saw many advances during that time. Following that, after independence, we have had, two stellar, people leading development of the city. Point being that if you let city elites take care of cities, you will get a much better job than if you try to make this a burden of politicians and bureaucrats in state government or in central government. It doesn't work that way. I'm told always when I say this that cities have no capacity, but then that's what the British used to say about India. We can't free India because you cannot. They don't have capacity to govern themselves. Unfortunately, we still have that patronizing attitude. I'd like to add one more thing. Urban planning at one stage in India during colonial times and just up to the point of independence was a local government function. Cities were charged of making their own plans and organizing planning. It's only after independence, actually, that we ended up turning urban planning into a state government function. This was at the behest of the central government, and a method of planning was invented and put in place that completely gave all planning powers to state government. This was very unfortunate because what they did was they completely made planning dysfunctional. So what we need is cities to have planning function has to be something part of the municipal corporation. You cannot run cities which are planned from state government capitals, because then their planning is all serving state government purposes rather than. And final thing I'd like to add is I think what Professor Bertaud said already, that the nature of planning has to change from being, from trying to replace markets. Planning has to work with markets. So with that, I'll stop at this point. And these 3 points: cities have to be freed and autonomous. Planning has to be a local government function entirely, and planning has to work with markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this. Dr. Agarwal, if I may ask you the same question.
Thanks, Shivani. Speaking after Alan and Bimal is not an easy job, but nevertheless, let me try a bit. I'm picking up from what both of them have said in some way or the other, but the basic points I would make is our planning systems need to change. I think Bimal brought that up very nicely. They need to change. I think there should be a much, much stronger economic anchor to our planning process. What's the city going to be doing, or what kind of economic activities will be predominant in a certain city over the next 20 years, or what is the economic vision for that city, is something that has to be the first thing that we pick up. And after doing that, then we get to know what kind of infrastructure does the city need, what infrastructure does it already have, what more do we need. Once we have identified our infrastructure needs, then we get to know how much land we need and for what purpose. I think that really has to be the sequence that should be followed, starting with an economic vision and then working down to how much land you need for what purpose. And that's where the land use planning really should then come up. The other thing that cities need to have, I feel very strongly, is that today our master plan, so to say, do not have an environment plan. They do not have a climate plan. They don't even have a mobility plan. The mobility plan document is developed as a very separate document and developed by transportation engineers rather than urban planners. So I think a lot of these need to change and change significantly. What I would feel very happy about is if for every city, we could have one comprehensive plan which brings all these things together. One other thing that I would like to add, and this is where, while I completely agree with Bimal that, capacities in the cities need to be built, and we shouldn't say lack of capacity is a barrier. Capacity needs to be built. But in some way, we should not forget that cities have a close linkage to their rural hinterland. And the rural areas that come between two cities also are in many ways linked to what's happening in the cities. There are sort of interlinkages between the two. And I think the planning process should bring these, or at least recognize these, in the kind of plan document that we build up in the future. Let me stop with that. Not much more that I could have said after Alan and Bimal.
Those are very noble ideas. Thank you so much, Dr. Agarwal. Mr. Verma, Mr. Shashi Verma.
Thank you, Shivani, and good
Yes.
afternoon, everyone. It's of course it gets harder, Amrita. You're just going to get this the hardest slot. It gets harder after everyone's spoken. I would start with a provocative question to answer the question of what reimagination means. You have to start by asking the question, why do cities exist? And cities exist, in my view, for one simple reason, which is that they allow economic activity to organize itself more productively than would happen if you just spread the whole activity around. That is the rationale for why cities have existed for the last 10,000 years. Ever since the first cities came about in southern Turkey and northern Syria 10,000 years ago, that has been the rationale for cities. And cities have been, one of the greatest inventions of humankind. Very few cities ever die. They die for very specific reasons, for environmental factors or lack of political support. But economic entities, once they're created, are incredibly resilient. It's something that's been missing from all of our consideration about urbanization in India. And again, to be provocative, I think if you look back at our history of urbanization, we have looked at the stream of people coming into urban areas from the rural hinterlands as a bit of an irritation, to be accommodated begrudgingly rather than to be integrated into creating a more productive economy. And when you think about the challenge that India has, not just on urbanization, but on development as a whole, how do we get to a more productive economy? The answer is usually, let's put more people in manufacturing and so on. But the reality is that very few people are involved in manufacturing. The real growth story lies in cities, but it has been completely ignored in our thinking for many, many decades, and is still being ignored for that matter. We still do not regard cities as the engines of growth. You do not find politicians going out and saying, I want to attract investment to cities. What they're looking for a facility. How can I attract some manufacturing facility to come in and locate in my city? But they're not specifically looking for, not in the city, manufacturing to locate somewhere in the state. No one is actually attracting investment in the cities. And cities still thrive to an extent. People are still coming into cities, but they're coming out of a necessity rather than out of an attraction. It's only because life is so much harder in rural areas. So I think this is something that has to become central to our thinking about the future of economic growth in India. And when I talk about that sort of attraction into cities, it's not just about the mega cities. The metropolitan cities get all the attention, but the reality is urbanization is happening at all levels. The cities that have a population of 1 lakh are also cities that also deserve attention and also deserve some level of planning. Our problem is that the failure of planning is so visible in the larger cities that's where all the attention goes. But the first step for many people coming out of rural areas is not typically to a metropolitan city; it is to an adjacent small town. So this problem of urbanization exists at many levels. But if we accept the fact that cities are engines of organizing activity in a more productive manner, productivity has to be at the heart of our urban planning debate. And to repeat what Professor Bertaud said at the beginning, cities are a way of organizing labor markets. Absolutely true. But organizing labor markets to achieve productivity. And that has to become the center of our economic planning. What we have done instead is fracture cities by trying to distribute demand. The prevalent philosophy has been that we have not wanted to invest in infrastructure for many decades. And as demand has increased, what we have tried to do is to decentralize cities to create this fragmented urban space. The result of which is that we don't actually have cities. There is no real city in India. What we have is a collection of overlapping villages, where people travel from everywhere to everywhere. This idea of nice hermetically sealed cities, which has been the dominant philosophy, is patently untrue. But it has become the method by which we have fragmented cities to the extent that we have. So if we look for a new imagination for cities, you only need to look at cities that have been successful. All of them, roughly speaking, follow a similar pattern, which is that they have very dense urban core. It's fed by dense means of transport. And outside the dense urban core, they're able to provide high quality housing. And along with high quality housing, they're able to provide high quality local services. So, I mean, if I take the example of London, which is, if you look at London today, it incorporates many villages as they used to be. Those villages have now become town centers. People talk about the 15-minute city. I can actually live my life within 15 minutes of where I live for everything apart from my commute to work. All of my shopping, all of my facilities, my hospital, my local healthcare, my pharmacy, my grocery shop, everything is literally within a 15-minute reach, apart from employment. And the employment is where the productivity comes from. So there is a design, there is a pattern behind how cities have become successful. It is not the pattern that we follow in India, but it's not difficult to see what that pattern needs to be. So I think the first thing is to understand that urban cores are really critical. The second point that goes along with it is you cannot create an urban core following the model of development that we have, which is we are mimicking an American model of development, which is the government will build the road and you get your own vehicle and we carry on. It's a very low density mode of transport. And the one thing you need to realize about India is that we have a population density like no one else. India's population density is 12 times higher than the US. And the development path that the US followed is not available in India at all. In fact, the development path that people followed in Europe is not available either. We have to have a development path that is more intense than Europe, and it can only ever be supported by high density transport. What has happened instead, to refer to what Bimal said earlier, is now that we have realized the need for infrastructure is kind of being dropped from helicopters into cities, right? A metro here, a metro there, with no regard to what it does.
Yes.
Sorry, there's a fire alarm test going on here. But it's been with no regard to whether that infrastructure fits into the city or not. So I think that is something that we need to reverse as well. Sorry.
May I have your attention, please? Yes. Fire has been reported.
I think we'll have to go to the next speaker.
No, I think Shashi's back. We'll just check. Oh, sorry, Shivani, go ahead.
Is Shashi there or?
Sorry, I'm back. Yes. Sorry for the interruption with the fire alarm test. So, integrating, the key thing here, and this is something that we've learned from London, the key thing here is to integrate land use and transport planning. That is how you build dense urban cores. That is how you build density, and that's how you get to productivity. So I think that's something that's very critical that India needs to address. And I would say that India and some other developing countries face this challenge in a way that the developed world never faced, because this happened in the developed world over many, many, many decades. We don't have the luxury of time on our side. And finally, I would just echo the point that Bimal made earlier, which is that you can't solve this problem with the fragmented governance structure that we have today. The reason that decision-making is so poor is that decision-making is being done in silos. I'll give you an example of this, again, referring back to what all previous speakers have said. You look at any urban master plan, there are certain things that get done and there are certain things that don't get done. All the things that get done in the urban master plan are things that are the responsibility of one agency alone. The things that don't get done are things that require coordination between two agencies. As we know, that coordination never happens. And it's telling you very clearly that coordination is not enough. What we need is integration of governance. Right. There are many models for how that can be achieved, but without that integration, we will carry on making the mistakes that we've made in the past. Thank you.
Right. We'll come back to you. Thank you so much for putting so much in those 5 minutes. Yes. Amrita.
Yeah. Thank you, Shivani.
Yes.
I'm happy to
Please
go
go.
last. I hope everybody can hear me. Everybody wonderfully spoke before me about how important cities are, especially we need to densify cities and drive economic growth. And that's extremely important. And Professor Patel spoke about unlocking productivity, which is maximizing the potential of the labor market. Unfortunately, there's also a negative side to densification and economic growth in cities, which is negative spillovers to health, which can have a vicious negative cycle. In the early days of industrialization, there was this, intense wave of sickness which was there in Europe, and then there was a whole drive to clean up the cities and therefore, make the labor market more productive. I feel like when I look at Tokyo, for example, it went through waves of it. So there was urbanization, then in 50s, 70s, 60s, there was all this negative spillovers from densification and economic growth. And then there was an effort to clean this up and therefore move forward. So an important part of unlocking productivity is also to do active management of health at the local level. And that's the other aspect to talk about, which is quality of life and well-being. And there I would sort of say there's an inherent assumption that, perhaps when we become richer, we will sort of, be able to make those investments. There's also this perhaps latent thinking, I do not know how widespread it is, that our cities are too large and, Shashi, you spoke about it, they're very dense. So our ability to manage, public health and well-being and quality of life is very difficult in India. But again, looking at some of the Asian cities which were able to address these challenges in 70s and 60s, I do not necessarily think it is about scale or income. It is really about something else. In my opinion, there are 3 or 4 things which could be the something else. And, we need to sort of do more deeper work on this. The first one I would say is the urban planning everybody spoke about, but with a public health lens. So we know, for example, sunlight and ventilation is very, very important for infectious diseases. We all heard it during COVID. I think COVID has been a big lesson for a lot of the non-health people that, sunlight, ventilation, many things on how housing structure should be sort of encouraged. The urban planning element of it, how do you wear a public health hat to it? So I think there's the intersection of urban planning and health. And this is almost like a capability, I would say. I do not know how much we exercise in the Indian city urban planning effort. I don't think every city needs to have that capability, but we definitely need to have a better capability on embedding public health thinking in urban planning. So that is the one area I would say. The second area I would say is almost this integrated disease surveillance at the local level. Again, we all learned during COVID. This is fantastic in some way that everybody knows disease surveillance through COVID. But that was one disease. And we all experienced surveillance for one disease. And now we have all forgotten about it because, we don't need surveillance anymore. But just the morbidity of disease in India is actually very high. So in India, urban cities are 10 years behind other developed cities in terms of life expectancy, in terms of healthy life lived, which is no disease-free life lived, we are much, much more behind. We constantly know our colleagues are falling ill. I myself am a little bit unwell right now. And because of the negative spillovers of cities, right? And the lifestyle we lead. So the integrated disease surveillance doesn't have to be when there's a pandemic. For every, when there's a TB, what is the TB incidence in different cities? Or what is the cholera, malaria incidence in different cities? Should we do more vector control in this ward versus different intervention in other cities? So this local level integrated disease surveillance is a very important aspect. I do not think it's done systematically, and it can be done smartly. Coordination with labs. We again saw during COVID, a lot of labs were pulling in data and sort of being able to interpret that data to understand. So we've learned some lessons, we've experienced it, and we've not sort of taken that forward. This is something which the union government sort of talks about, but again, I don't think it's a union level subject. This has to be done at the local level. What is your ward's disease pattern and how is that shifting constantly? So the third thing I would say is based on this data, which is what is the action task force? Again, we all experienced during COVID that based on the data, there could be specific actions which are taken. We have to enable the labor force to be really healthy, to be able to take maximum advantage of it. And there's a lot of intervention which can be done at the population level, which can be done. So this is about capability for local action. And again, not at the union level, state level, but at the local level. So these are the three things I would say, and there are many more things on the healthcare side of it, which I haven't yet spoken. But these three things I would say are more at the local population level. When you look at other large cities globally which have done this well. And this is where I would say we are lacking, but there is an effort required to make this work and with a bit of experimentation. It is not large amounts of money, but it is something which can be only driven by local level, and because of the federal nature of things, local level not being strong enough, not being engaged with the local community, this piece is also missing. So I want to say the new imagination, this is something we need to totally address.
Right. Thank you so much, Amrita. So we've all heard our experts address different aspects of how to catalyze economic growth in our cities. We will be soon opening up this discussion to the audience, so please send in your questions. So far, hearing you all, I gathered that there were some common thread in your discourse. You all agree that the narrative around urbanization has changed and changed positively from the traditional belief that India lived in villages to the conviction that this is indeed India's urban century. But at the same time, we have constraints, policy constraints, regulatory constraints, institutional constraints. So the journey ahead is clearly not going to be very easy. So the challenge, of course, is to address the gaps and resolve issues in managing our cities. I have a question for Dr. Bertaud. As someone who has been looking at Indian cities closely since 1960s, you've seen a lot of changes, and some for good, some for bad, worse. And you also pointed out the strategies to unlock the economic potential of cities. So what do you think? How do you think our pace is, when it comes to addressing these issues, implementing strategies? Do you think the pace is good? Because, all these years we've ignored urban spaces. So clearly we have a lot of catching up to do.
Well, I think, yes. I think, if you look from the 60s to now, there was an anti-urban bias for a very, very long time. Migrants were considered to be burdened, people were desperately trying to keep them in the countryside. They didn't realize that, there was this idea that every migrant coming to the city will require an investment of, say, 1 lakh rupee or something like that. And they say, well, we don't have the money, so they should stay in the countryside. There was also this, I think, in India, but in my own country, France, was the same thing. The idea that a very large city was expanding at the expense of smaller cities. So there was a bias also against, for instance, expansion of Mumbai, and deciding that somewhere in Himachal Pradesh, some city should grow, and the factory, the enterprise wanted to move to either Delhi, Calcutta, or Mumbai, should be directed by government to Himachal Pradesh, where they were badly in need of industrialization. So all these concepts were very, very detrimental to cities. One of the worst, of course, was Urban Land Ceiling Act, during the emergency. That was really very destructive. But so this is over now. India has paid a price for this bad policy, in fact, losing time. But I think that now I see a completely different view. There are still a lot of problems, as my colleague have described, but in general, I think there is a positive attitude towards city, and I think economics suddenly become more important. People understand that markets are sending signal, so some prices are distorted, but our job is to remove the distortion, is not to ignore the signal. So that will be, but so I'm rather very positive actually on the development city, because again, I have a very long perspective, and so it came a long way. The change is very important, I think.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective, the historical perspective, I'd say. Dr. Patel, you have discussed the reimagination that is needed in urban planning. So how do cities put this reimagination into practice? And an additional question is, is it always appropriate to seek inspiration from the Western world? And the question arises from a recent podcast, where you mentioned that urban areas in India are at the same stage where European cities were back in 19th century. So we should focus on what those cities did a century ago than what they're doing now. Could you elaborate on this thought?
You're still on mute, Bimal.
Sorry, I was on mute. So I did say that, and I would maintain that there is much to be learned from the West. There's simply no question about it. We are latecomers to urbanization. Urbanization poses many practical problems that are the same the world over. We are not special, okay? And we can learn a lot from them. The question is what to learn from them and what not to learn. We are at this point at a very different stage of urbanization. But we are just sort of on third urban, and we are slowly, our cities are growing. They've yet to grow. We are also economically very poor compared to what the West is right now. We simply don't have the kind of resources and wealth that those cities have at their command. So we are very much at a stage like what European cities were in during the 19th century. And there is I believe from whatever work I do, that there is a lot more we would learn if we would look at what was done in 19th century European and American cities. Of course, there are differences, but there's much to learn because growth management was their biggest issue. Growth of cities, managing the growth of cities and ensuring orderly development and good public health. These sort of things was really what was important for them. We can learn from that. So that is, I'd stress that we bark up the wrong tree when we try to do what's in the latest fashion in the West right now, which they can very often afford to do, and which they use large megaphones to promote. And those are not the sort of issues that we should or can tackle at this stage of development. We still have to go. Cities take a long time to improve. They only improve incrementally. They take couple of 2 or 3 generations, if you do it right, for them to come out right eventually. So we are not going to be world-class very soon, but we will never be if we don't take the steps the first steps that we have to take. So that's point number 1. You asked something about planning. I think I completely agree with Professor Bertaud. I've also been in this business quite long, certainly not as long as him, but I am also very, when we started in the early 90s, we still had to argue for the importance of cities. It's no longer the case. Everybody understands the importance of cities. Now everybody has also started paying lip service to the fact that we have to work with markets rather than not. but I say lip service in this way, that they still haven't got out of old modes of thought, planners. What they mean, I'm afraid, very often is that planning should be done in the way that market outcomes would be like. They don't want to let the market do the job. Therefore, they want to plan things as if the market had produced that solution. I don't know if I get that, but
yes,
I 100% know that Shashi does not mean this. Nonetheless, the language that is used, we should integrate land use and planning. I would use a slightly different language, and then I think Shashi means what I'm proposing. Let land use and planned elements of the city integrate themselves. Don't try to go there and fix the land use in such a way that it matches with the transport, for example. So transport and land use have to integrate, but they have to integrate by themselves, Baba. You don't have to sit there and draw a plan that integrates them. And I would, respectfully also say that, it's the job of city elites to create an economic vision. It always has been. The wealth of this country has been created by city elites. It's not some planner sitting in government or some bureaucrat sitting in government that creates an economic vision that everybody has to follow. After all, the wealth of India has been created by the visionaries like the Tatas and the Ambanis and the Adanis, whatever we might say of them. These are the people who have provided India with the economic vision. It's not the government's job to create economic vision for that everybody else has to follow. That was the old style thinking. That with all due respect, I don't think OP means that, but I think the language we use suddenly, makes us drop back into the other sort of trap. So I'll stop at that.
Dr. Agarwal, you talk about regional planning, but you know for sure that administrative convergence is not very easy to achieve in India, especially when there are so many competing interests at play. So drawing from your experience in the government and also as a senior policy advisor, could you tell us how can cities navigate this contested space? Also, is there a political incentive to push systemic reforms through? Oh, is he on mute?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So let me start by saying that no, the intention I had was never that bureaucrats sitting somewhere far away are going to develop that economic vision. It has to be by the elite. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So it has to be by the elites of the city. It has to be political leadership.
Right.
It is not bureaucratic leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Bureaucrats are supposed to be doing what they're asked to do. I completely agree with Bimal. If bureaucrats take on that leadership role, then the incentives are very different. It has to be locally led.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I would say is, and this also can be politically led, it can be elite led, it's not bureaucratic led. The only thing I would say is somehow there has to be an integration between the city or the plan for that city, the economic plan for that city, and the economic activities in the region surrounding it. The two can't be delinked.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it is possible to have all of this done through an economic leadership model, through a political leadership model.
Mm-hmm.
The examples that we have today in terms of, say, the MMRDA or the National Capital Region Planning Board,
Mm-hmm.
or many other development authorities that we have, where the bureaucracy has taken that leadership. There's really no need to do that. The other thing is we always do talk about, power being given to the cities. I don't disagree with that. I completely agree with that. They should have the authority. But I'm trying to be a little realistic on this. No state political leader wants that to happen. And if we keep saying that this is what must be done, this is what must be done, and unless that is done, nothing else is possible, I think then we are living in a bit of we're being impractical in many ways. I'm not denying the fact that this is needed. I fully believe this is needed. But are we going to keep saying that unless this is done, nothing can happen to our cities? They've gone, haywire. I think there are at least two models that I've seen, which may not be the best, but there are two models I have seen which can work. For example, in Assam, the present chief minister of Assam at one point was the minister at the state level, the minister in charge of developing Guwahati. They had a department called the Department for Guwahati Development. The minister in charge was the person who is the present chief minister. He was elected from Guwahati. So can we have somebody who is a locally elected person to the state assembly getting into a department or leading a department at the state level to be, handling this city or maybe even the region around that city? As a political leadership, that's one model. The other model that I've seen is in Maharashtra, not as good as the Guwahati model to my mind, but every city has some kind of a guardian minister. Now, that guardian minister can do a lot of things at the state level which the local municipal commissioner may not be able to do. And he should be able to provide a political vision for that city which the municipal commissioner will not be able to provide. So I think these are possible. I, for one, would plead that, let's say, nothing can be done unless the power is given to the cities. There are some negatives also with that. Again, I'm giving you another example. So China is looking at, 19 city clusters. Each city cluster has a large number of cities around. And what I was required to do at one stage as part of an ADB project is go down to one cluster and see what is happening there. Now, I found it very interesting. A lot of people that I met, they said in China, the mayors are so powerful that everything happens within the city. But if you're looking for a cluster, you need connectivity between cities. No one is taking care of that because the states are very, weak. It's the cities that are powerful. So, I'm just bringing these thoughts to mind that I think we can come up with our own model. I think there can be political leadership to the economic visioning, not a bureaucratic leadership. But then it's something that we need to try out. I'll stop with that for now.
Mr. Verma, I have a question on mobility. And here I would say that, there's not a lot of positivity around the way we've handled mobility in our cities. So, clearly our cities are trapped in induced demand. We are building more roads. We get more vehicles. We build even more. So is there a way out of this Sisyphean cycle, especially when roads and vehicles are linked to aspirations? They are indicators of growth, development, both at individual and social level.
Thank you, Shivani. I think I will address that question, but I just also want to tie up a few points that Amrita, OP, and Bimal have made in the past year. So the first thing here is to say, look, let me make this discussion a bit spiky here by disagreeing with Bimal just a little bit here, right? The problem with elite-based thinking is that elite-based thinking is at the root of some of the problems that we've got right now, right? That our planning is for the elite. It's not for the city. India has one of the highest rates of pedestrian traffic, foot traffic. They do not exist in our imagination at all. They're completely invisible to us, right? When you look at our labor markets, one of the reasons why our cities are able to work at the density that we have is that a lot of the employment is hyper-local. The domestic help that you have live locally. They quote-unquote commute to work on foot. They do not exist in our imagination. What we try creating is these sort of elite facilities where people can go for morning walks and all that. But this is where I wanted to also tie up a point that Amrita was making earlier, that actually a well-designed city can lead to good health outcomes, not just bad health outcomes. We are leading to bad health outcomes because of poorly designed cities. So what can you do about this? I think the first thing here is that in our planning, we need to invert the thinking and say, how do we get to density, which is the point that I was making earlier. You get to density by high density transport, which is rail and public transport, not single occupancy cars, which has become the core of our thinking, right? And I don't disagree at all that there is a very big element of aspiration involved in it, and it's not easy to overcome that aspiration. But aspiration is not the only factor. Economic incentives are a very big factor in the choices that people make. The fact is, we provide free parking everywhere. We don't provide free housing for anyone, but we allow cars to park on public land for free. So the cars have been put in this exalted position of having a higher priority than poor people, where they can park for free, but poor people cannot live for free. The police will come and chase you off if you sleep on the footpath, but no one disturbs a car parked on the footpath. This is where the thinking needs to be inverted. And when the thinking is inverted, by starting to price for low density forms of transport appropriately for the use of public space, for the externalities that they create, and on the other side, provide a better quality public transport system, it is possible to change these aspirations. I have a car in London. Quite why I have a car in London, I don't know, because I don't drive much, but I do have a car in London. I have not driven to work ever in my life, not one day. And if you could get to even that sort of outcome, where you have a car if you need one for your family, there's no one stopping you from having one, but just reduce the demand that's coming from single occupancy cars, right? It can only come by push and pull factors. The push factor is to start pricing for low density transport in the way that they should. The pull factor is by improving public transport. So I think all of these things have to be done, and there's no single answer to these. These things have to be done in consonance with each other to achieve the right outcome. One final point that I'd make, and this debate that was going on between Bimal and OP about governance. The right answer is that cities should be empowered, right? We also know that right answer is not about to happen because it requires a revolution. But a second best answer, which is empowered ministers at state levels who recognize that their votes may come from the rural areas, but their money comes from the cities. That would be a very big change in itself. And the fact that they need to compete with other states to make their cities competitive, to attract investment, to attract jobs, to make the cities productive, to provide a higher quality of life, I think that would be a very good question. I've gone around and spoken to people in many states in India, and the question you have to ask them is, you go to Bhopal, for example, you go there and ask them the question: if you wanted to sit in front of the chairman of Infosys and say, "Come and locate here, what's your pitch?" And they can't answer that question. And if there was a minister in charge of the city whose job it was to answer that question, that would be a very big start by itself without waiting for a revolution.
Right. That was a very good thought. Amrita, I have the next question for you. You talked about negative spillovers in cities. So, the change we're seeing now, and it's manifesting in a lot of negative way, is the climate change crisis, pollution, and they clearly have a downside, as far as health goes. So do you think in our public health management, we are addressing these issues adequately?
I think the answer we all know is probably not. And when I reflect, Shivani, on why and what can we do about it instead of being so pessimistic and stay about it. I feel like there's a fundamental disconnect in the way health discourse has happened in India. Having worked more in the health and health policy and healthcare side of things, a focus has been on the union and subject and the state level, and gone from troubleshooting one priority to the second emergency to the third emergency. So when you see, say, HIV/AIDS or maternal child health care, or COVID or tuberculosis, so when you see the discourse at the national level or at the state level, often we seem to be lurching from one problem statement to the other. And for example, now heat stroke from climate change. So it's very, very whatever is the current most prominent priority of the
from one meltdown to the other, the next, yes.
Correct. And then we don't build systems to really sort of take forward the work at the more systematic level. Now, part of the reason, at least this is my diagnosis, is the public health work, which I just spoke about, the negative spillovers, most of this is at the local level. And it goes back to not having accountability, ownership, and bottom-up ownership of the local level negative spillovers. So I'm not talking about the national level ones, but really the local. Many of these things are, mercury, arsenic in the water. These are local level issues. Now, once we have more local level ownership, and like again, I go back to Japan when I was studying it. The women in the cities of Japan were like, no, when the economic growth was at its peak, ramping up post the World War in 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of negative spillovers. This is a local community which came up and said, hey, we should do something about it. How do we address the negative spillovers? So I think the local community ownership, and it's not a lot of money. Again, I think we are looking. There's a lot of top-down when you look at National Health Mission or PMJY, Ayushman Bharat. These are healthcare-oriented efforts. But the bottom-up community engagement on this negative spillovers, the public health, public goods of it, has to be bottom-up. And it's not a lot of money. When you do the calculations, and I think we at some point should do a bottom-up calculation, I suspect when I look at the city's budgets, they're small components. So the awareness that health is not equal to healthcare, and we have gotten so used to the idea, or it is about only about what an individual can do in terms of food and exercise, but it's a local spillover work has to come into public consciousness, and local community engagement and local capacity building at state local level is needed. And I think linked to that is making it more visible. It is so invisible today. There's no data, there's no discourse on it. It is this, amorphous thing which nobody sort of pays attention, because we are hoping that individuals will take care of it, or some insurance will take care of it, or some union level program will take care of it. I feel like that is where things could dramatically change. A more systematic integrated disease surveillance program, a team which sort of looks at all the downstream effect of why those diseases are happening in that city, and then the urban planning interlinkage with public health. I think those things are more systematic efforts, will only happen with local visibility of data and local ownership.
Pritika, I'd like to bring you in. The Artha report gave a very interesting new perspective on how we can look at the climate crisis and cities. Could you just elaborate on some of those points?
Sure, Shivani. And Shashi, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to respond to Amrita? And then I'll go ahead.
Just very briefly, I think when Amrita says disease, it's not just infectious disease. A lot of transport linkage is to lifestyle diseases. Not walking enough, not exercising enough, leading to diabetes, cardiac issues, and so on. And this is where good public transport can play a very big role. Yeah. The point about public transport is that it forces you into an active lifestyle, which is completely different from the sedentary lifestyle of a single occupancy car.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Pritika?
So, and actually,
back to you. Yes.
Thanks, Shivani. That ties in perfectly with what I was going to say. So
yes.
There's a lot of conversation about climate change in cities. And like Bimal said earlier, what we tend to do is not borrow the 19th century lessons from the West when they were dealing with rapid urbanization, borrow the current ones. And yes. I think the climate conversation is part of that. So what we are picking up is the adaptation conversation, which is very important because we need to prepare our cities for flooding. We just ran a big survey on heat stress across the country, and it's terrifying what it does to productivity and livelihoods. We're doing work on air pollution. So the adaptation challenges are real. But there's a big mitigation piece that we need to think about, and that is India, South Asia, Africa are still urbanizing, right? So we are going to build the next 200, 300 cities. And how we build those cities will determine our long-term national emissions trajectory, right? We can talk about it sectorally all we want. We can talk about transport, but all of that runs through cities. So the way we like to say it is there are 4 paths to decarbonization that run directly through cities. One is public transport. The second is choice of urban energy systems. construction. And the fourth, which goes to the planning conversation we've all had, is urban form. And so if we don't revise our planning regulations and we continue to build land-intensive cities there versus compact, walkable, dense cities that are serviced by public transport, we end up with two completely different emission scenarios. So one of the things that I think all of us on this panel have been keen is to say, what is the mitigation conversation to be had on climate? And what is the role of planning and planning ahead for growth in that?